He was a billionaire CEO dining alone, until his 6-year-old daughter pointed at a street boy and whispered, "Daddy, that's my brother." What happened next shattered everything he thought he knew about his past. Edward Hale was a man who had everything on the surface. At 35, he was the founder and CEO of Hale Tech, one of California's most powerful and innovative technology firms. His face was on the cover of Forbes, his name constantly cited in business news, and his company stock was a pillar of Wall Street stability. He was the kind of man who turned heads when he walked into a room. Tall, sharply built, with carefully tousled chestnut hair and striking brown eyes that could be both commanding and compassionate. His signature light-colored suits had become a symbol of cool confidence and control. But beneath the impeccable appearance, Edward carried a grief so heavy it had never truly let him sleep in 6 years. Behind every decisive meeting, every successful merger, and every product launch was the echo of a moment that had shattered his world. It was 6 years ago when his wife, Clare, 8 months pregnant with their child, vanished without a trace. That morning had begun like any other. Coffee together on the balcony, a brief kiss goodbye, and a whispered reminder to call after her prenatal appointment. But she never came back. Hours turned into days, days into weeks. The police found no leads, no signs of struggle, no note. Just her parked car near a small county clinic and silence. Then came a strange discovery. A nurse at that same clinic had anonymously reported a newborn girl abandoned in the neonatal unit 2 days after Claire's appointment. The baby had no name, no birth certificate. She was perfectly healthy. DNA confirmed she was Edward's daughter. There was no record of Claire ever being admitted. There was no trace of a second child, though earlier sonograms had shown twins. It was as if she'd vanished into thin air, leaving behind only half of what she carried. Edward named the baby Sophia and raised her alone. He poured his soul into her care, holding her during sleepless nights, telling her stories Claire would have told. He never spoke about the pain to anyone, not to his parents, not to the board, not even to Sophia. But it was there in every line on his face, every glance that lingered too long on empty spaces in the room. He spent millions hiring private investigators, forensic experts, and data analysts. He followed every rumor, every whisper. One detective in Arizona claimed to have seen a woman matching Claire's description in a shelter. But that lead went cold. Another reported a woman with amnesia had been admitted to a hospital in Oregon, but she disappeared before Edward could arrive. Each false hope carved a deeper scar. Sophia was the only thing that kept him going. She had her mother's hair, soft and golden like sunlight, and the same piercing blue eyes. She was bright, curious, and full of questions he sometimes struggled to answer. Despite all he had lost, she gave him purpose. But still, late at night, he would sit alone in the massive library of his estate, nursing a glass of untouched bourbon, staring at the last photo ever taken of Claire, her hand resting on her swollen stomach, smiling, radiant, alive. He had never given up on her, never stopped wondering about the missing twin. But as the years passed, even Edward had begun to believe that perhaps some answers would remain forever buried. Then on an ordinary spring day, while holding Sophia's small hand and walking through the park, something happened. Something so unexpected, so unreal, that it would shake everything he thought he knew. Something that would unravel secrets buried deep in time and awaken hope where there had only been grief. And it would all begin with 6 words shouted by a 6-year-old girl. "Daddy, that's my brother. Look." Edward turned his head, still gripping Sophia's small hand in his own, though she had tugged toward the boy with such urgency that he almost stumbled forward. For a moment, he thought she must be confused. It wasn't unusual. She was imaginative, often dreaming up elaborate stories about princesses, secret twins, or magical animals. But the tone in her voice wasn't playful. It was piercing, certain. The boy she pointed to sat alone on the edge of the fountain, legs tucked close to his chest, arms wrapped tightly around his knees. He wore a faded blue t-shirt, too thin for the weather, and torn jeans with dusty cuffs. His blonde hair was long, unbrushed, and fell across his forehead in uneven strands. But what stopped Edward in his tracks wasn't the boy's clothes. It wasn't even the fact that he appeared to be alone, clearly unsupervised. It was his face. There, under layers of dirt and weariness, were features so familiar they hit Edward like a punch to the chest. The shape of the boy's chin, the curve of his lips, the nose, Claire's, and then he looked up. Edward's knees almost gave out. The boy's eyes were wide, round, and ice blue, the exact same shade as Sophia's, the exact same shade as Claire's. He blinked at Sophia, who was now standing right in front of him. "Hi," she said, almost shy now that she was so close. "Hi," the boy replied, his voice small, hoarse, but not frightened. Sophia turned to Edward, her face full of urgency. "He looks just like Mommy, just like me." Edward slowly stepped forward, kneeling down beside the two children, trying not to overwhelm the boy. "Hey, buddy," he said gently. "Are you here with someone? Your parents?" The boy hesitated, shaking his head slowly. "I'm by myself." "For how long?" "I don't know." He looked down, fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. "A while." Edward's instincts as a father, protector, and man who had spent 6 years haunted by questions surged forward, but he knew not to frighten the child. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Noah." The name struck him like thunder. Claire had always loved that name. When they discussed baby names before the twins were born, she'd told him if one was a boy, she wanted to name him Noah. He had loved the sound of it too. It was written on their early ultrasound photos. He hadn't heard it spoken aloud since she disappeared. "Do you know your last name, Noah?" Edward asked. The boy looked confused. "I think someone said it was Miller, but I don't know." Edward turned his gaze to Sophia, who had already sat beside Noah. The two of them huddled together like old friends. She offered him part of a granola bar from her jacket pocket. He took it without hesitation. "Do you remember your parents?" Edward asked, barely able to keep his voice steady. The boy looked down again. "I remember a lady. She used to sing to me. A song about stars." Edward's heart stilled. Claire used to sing that very song to Sophia when she was a baby. A lullaby she made up herself. "Sleep under the silver stars and I'll find you wherever you are." He remembered the words. He remembered her voice. "I think she was my mom," Noah said, "but I don't know where she went." Edward swallowed hard, fighting the rising emotion in his throat. He needed to be sure. He needed facts. But everything inside him was screaming this wasn't just a resemblance. This wasn't a coincidence. He stood up and pulled out his phone, calling Daniel, his head of security. "I need a car brought around, quietly, and I need a contact from Child Protective Services on the line. Now." "Understood," came the immediate response. Less than 10 minutes later, the children were in the back of Edward's car, seated side by side. Sophia had insisted Noah sit with her. She held his hand tightly, her eyes serious. At the estate, Edward ushered them inside. Margaret, the housekeeper who had helped raise Sophia, was waiting with open arms and immediate concern. Edward explained the situation in brief, instructing that Noah be given clean clothes, a warm bath, and something to eat. Margaret nodded and moved quickly. Later that evening, Edward sat alone in his study, fingers trembling as he submitted a formal request for DNA testing. He contacted 2 independent labs requesting rush processing. Blood samples were taken discreetly with Noah's consent, explained kindly as a checkup. Sophia stood beside him the whole time. In the silence of his vast home, as he watched the boy and girl, so naturally close, so hauntingly alike, laugh over bedtime cartoons, something inside Edward cracked. What if this was his son? What if he had found the missing piece of his soul? And if Noah was here, what had happened to Claire? That night, Edward didn't sleep. He sat by the fireplace, staring into the embers, his heart pounding with questions. But for the first time in 6 years, there was something else too. Hope. Raw, terrifying, electrifying hope. Edward barely touched his coffee the next morning. It sat cooling on the mahogany breakfast table while he sat silently across from Sophia and Noah, watching them like a man watching a dream unfold in real life. Noah now wore clean clothes, a soft cotton t-shirt and new jeans, a far cry from the ragged outfit he had on the day before. His blonde hair had been trimmed, brushed, and his skin glowed with warmth after a night of restful sleep in a real bed. Yet what stunned Edward most wasn't the transformation. It was the bond forming between the two children as if no time or distance had ever separated them. They were laughing. genuinely, unself-consciously laughing as they shared a plate of pancakes Margaret had made. Sophia taught Noah how to drizzle syrup without making a mess. He, in turn, showed her how to stack slices to look like a tiny tower. Their conversations were simple, filled with childhood joy and curiosity. But to Edward, it was sacred, like hearing a language he thought he'd forgotten. Every now and then, Noah glanced at Edward with those same ocean blue eyes, filled with both wonder and caution. Edward knew he couldn't force anything, but the pull between them was unmistakable. It wasn't just because of resemblance or coincidence. It was blood. He felt it deep in his bones. The DNA test results arrived faster than expected. Two separate labs, both highly respected, both returning the same confirmation. Noah was Edward's biological son. There was no margin for error, no room for doubt. Edward held the printed results in his hands with trembling fingers. It was real. The boy sleeping under his roof, who shared pancakes with Sophia and asked if he could call Margaret Grandma Margaret, like Sophia did, was his son. But that joy came with a cascade of questions. Questions too dark and confusing to ignore. How had he ended up on the streets? Where had Claire gone after the birth? Why was Noah abandoned while Sophia was left in a hospital? He sat down in his office and called Julian Mason, the private investigator he'd used on and off over the years. Julian, I need you to reopen Claire's case, all of it. Go back to the beginning. Hospital records, surveillance archives, witness statements. I don't care if they're 6 years old. I want everything. Something's wrong. Julian, seasoned and sharp, had always respected Edward not only for his wealth, but for his unwavering devotion to truth. I'm on it, he replied simply, already taking notes. Meanwhile, Edward began speaking to Noah more directly. He waited for quiet moments, before bedtime, during walks in the garden, or while reading with the children. Gently, he asked questions. What do you remember about when you were little? Do you remember your mom's face? Do you remember any places? Songs? Noah's memories came in fragments, a warm hand brushing his hair, a soft voice humming a lullaby. Stars, he said again. She sang about stars. He remembered a white room, a crib next to a window, and a man yelling once. Not at him, but at someone else. Then the images would break, fade. He would grow silent. One day Noah shyly said, she had a necklace. It had pictures inside. One was me, I think, and another baby. Edward nearly dropped the book he was holding. A locket, Claire's locket. She had worn it every day during her pregnancy. He'd given it to her the day they found out they were expecting twins. Inside were tiny ultrasound photos, one of each child. He couldn't speak for a moment. He only reached out and pulled Noah gently to his chest, embracing him in a way that felt both foreign and long overdue. Noah didn't resist. He leaned in and, for the first time, called him Dad. Later that week, Julian reported back. He had tracked down a former nurse from the small county hospital, retired, hard to find, but cooperative. She remembered a woman fitting Claire's description who had been brought in under suspicious circumstances. No ID, no record. She had been in pain, disoriented, terrified. Two men dressed like orderlies but not staff had accompanied her. One nurse believed they weren't medical professionals at all. The woman had given birth to twins, but soon after, she vanished. The records were wiped. No surveillance footage was available. No official documents had ever been filed. What do you think happened? Edward asked, pacing his office. Julian hesitated. Someone took her, someone powerful enough to erase her presence without a trace, and they left the baby girl behind because it was too risky to move her. But the boy, they took him. Edward clenched his fists. It was one thing to live with loss. It was another to realize that loss may have been engineered. The thought that Claire might have been kidnapped, separated from her newborns, that someone orchestrated this entire nightmare, it made his blood boil. But now he had both children. Sophia and Noah were alive, safe, together. And if Claire was still out there, Edward swore to himself. He would find her, no matter what it took. Edward didn't waste a second. Every moment that passed now felt like a race against time. A countdown not to catastrophe, but to hope. For the first time in years, there was a tangible thread connecting the unthinkable loss of Claire to the miraculous return of their son. He couldn't ignore it, couldn't shelve it under old grief anymore. There were answers waiting to be unearthed, and he wouldn't rest until he uncovered every single one. He gathered the twins in his study that morning. Sophia and Noah sat close together on the oversized sofa, legs folded beneath them, their eyes wide with curiosity. They had grown inseparable in just a matter of days. They finished each other's sentences, shared whispered secrets, and even held hands in their sleep. Edward had always imagined what it would have been like to raise twins, to see the invisible thread of sibling love grow between them. Now he was watching it unfold in real time. He knelt in front of them and gently placed his hands on their knees. "There's something very important I need to do," he said, voice even and calm. "Something that might help us find out what really happened to your mom." Sophia's blue eyes shimmered. "Are you going to find her?" Edward hesitated for just a second, then nodded. "I'm going to try." Noah didn't speak right away, but when he did, it was almost a whisper. "I remember her singing, but not her face." "You'll remember," Edward said, brushing the boy's hair back. "We'll help you." While the children spent the afternoon in the care of Margaret, painting in the sunroom and playing puzzles side by side, Edward drove to meet Julian in a secure office suite downtown. There they reviewed files, old hospital logs, maps, photos, anything and everything from 6 years ago that might shed light on Claire's disappearance. But it was one piece of evidence Julian presented that set everything into motion. A grainy image from a security camera near the hospital exit taken the night Claire disappeared. The image had been recovered from a corrupted hard drive by a forensic data analyst Julian had hired. In it, a figure, slender, blonde, clearly in distress, was being helped into a black van by two men in unmarked uniforms. One of them appeared to flash a badge, but the image was too blurry to verify if it was official. Edward froze when he saw it. That was her. Claire. Confused, weak, but very much alive. "They took her," Edward murmured. "She didn't run. She was taken," Julian nodded grimly. "And I think I know who might have been behind it." Julian had uncovered a series of unusual financial transactions linked to a now-defunct private medical transport company, one that had operated under the radar and was quietly tied to a string of illegal adoption networks. According to a source, one of their clients had paid a substantial sum for a newborn male, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, from a woman admitted under emergency status in a rural clinic. No names were used, but the dates and location matched Claire's disappearance. "You think they tried to sell Noah?" Edward asked, fists clenched so tightly his knuckles whitened. "I think someone orchestrated a black market split of the twins," Julian said. "But something went wrong. The mother resisted. The girl was abandoned or left behind when the hospital started asking questions." "And Claire?" Edward's voice was nearly a growl. "I believe she escaped or was released, but not unscathed. I tracked a lead to a rehabilitation shelter in Nevada, one that specializes in trauma and amnesia cases. A woman arrived 5.5 years ago with no ID. She didn't speak for months. She had no memory of who she was or where she came from." Edward stood up so quickly his chair toppled behind him. "Is she still there?" "She disappeared last year," Julian replied. "But before she left, she gave someone a name." Edward leaned forward. "What name?" Julian pulled a photograph from a folder and handed it over. "Claire." Edward staggered back, sitting again. There she was. It was a low-resolution photo, but it was her. Older, thinner, her eyes hollow but familiar. His heart thudded against his chest. "She's alive." Julian's eyes met his. "And we're going to find her." Edward returned home that night, silent on the drive. He didn't know how to tell Sophia or Noah just yet, not until he had something real to give them. But as he walked into the house, the sound of the twins' laughter reached him from the hallway. They were playing hide and seek, taking turns counting and running between rooms. For a moment, he just watched them. They were alive. They were together. And now perhaps they could be whole. He walked past the grand staircase to the sitting room where Claire's portrait still hung above the mantel. It had been painted the year she disappeared. A gift from her to him, ironically. Her eyes in the painting looked straight ahead, as if she had known she'd need to be remembered this way. "I'm coming for you," Edward whispered aloud, voice cracking. "We all are." The next morning, Edward stood in the doorway of Sophia and Noah's playroom, watching them as they built an elaborate castle out of blocks. Their laughter filled the air, soft and innocent. But Edward's heart was far from calm. In his chest, a storm was building, of rage, disbelief, and hope battling for space. He had spent 6 years believing Claire was either dead or lost to some tragic accident. But now he knew she had been stolen, ripped away by people who had seen her and her unborn children as commodities. And worse, those same people had tried to erase her existence like she was nothing. But Claire wasn't nothing. She was everything. His partner, his love, the mother of his children. And if she was still out there, even a shred of her memory intact, he would find her, no matter how long it took or what it cost. Julian called mid-morning with an update. A tip had come in through a contact at a transitional shelter in Colorado. A woman matching Claire's description had shown up several months ago using the name Anna. She had been found by police wandering the edge of a highway after collapsing from exhaustion and dehydration. She had no ID, no memory of how she'd gotten there. The only thing she carried was a pendant, a small, heart-shaped locket that had been clutched in her hand so tightly it had left an imprint on her skin. Edward knew that locket. It had once held ultrasound images of the twins. He dropped everything and boarded his private jet within the hour. The flight to Colorado was quiet, almost eerily so. Edward sat by the window staring out at the endless clouds below, unable to stop the images rushing through his head. Claire holding his hand during the first sonogram. Claire whispering baby names late at night. Claire dancing barefoot in the kitchen while humming the lullaby she made up. And now, Claire lost, alone, traumatized, calling herself Anna. He clenched his fists, not from anger now, but from sheer helplessness. What had she endured? What had she seen? When he arrived at the shelter, the director, a gentle, middle-aged woman named Renee, greeted him cautiously. "She's fragile," she warned. When she arrived, she didn't speak for 2 weeks. Then she started remembering pieces. She remembers lullabies, blue eyes, the smell of lilacs. "We've been trying to help her reclaim who she is, but the past terrifies her. Every time we get close, she shuts down." "May I see her?" Edward asked, voice trembling despite himself. Renee nodded and led him through a modest hallway, lined with worn chairs and children's drawings. At the end was a room with large windows overlooking a garden. Inside sat a woman, thin but not sickly, her long blonde hair braided loosely down her back. She was drawing, 2 children holding hands. Edward stepped in slowly, afraid that the sound of his footsteps would shatter the moment. The woman looked up, and their eyes met. For a second, nothing happened. Then she froze, pencil slipping from her fingers, and stared. Her lips parted, her breath caught. "I know you," she whispered. Edward stepped closer, kneeling in front of her. "Claire," he said softly, the name like a prayer on his lips. "It's me. It's Edward." Tears welled in her eyes. Her body trembled, but she didn't pull away. I remember your voice. And your eyes. I know your eyes." She pressed a hand to her head as if trying to pull memories from inside her skull. "You were there. When I was scared. I held your hand. We had babies." "Yes," Edward said, voice cracking. "Twins. Sophia and Noah." Her head snapped up and a tear slipped down her cheek. "Noah? I dreamed of that name. I thought I made it up." "No," Edward said, reaching into his coat and pulling out his phone. He showed her a photo of the children, standing side by side, their blue eyes and blonde hair shining in the sun. Claire gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God!" "They're waiting for you," Edward whispered. "We all are." She burst into tears and leaned forward, collapsing into his arms. It wasn't a movie-perfect reunion. It was messy, raw, and fragile, but it was real. She shook in his arms as years of confusion and isolation broke open inside her. He held her as if letting go would tear her from his world again. For the next few hours, Claire spoke in fragments, of waking up in strange places, of being moved from facility to facility, of brief moments of clarity, only to be sedated again. Someone had tried to erase her, suppress her, hide her. She remembered a man's voice, needles, the smell of bleach and rubber gloves. But through it all, one image had remained. 2 babies, one in pink, one in blue. "I thought I dreamed them," she said, "but I never stopped singing to them, in my head, the star song. It was the only thing that kept me sane." Edward held her hands. You're not alone anymore. I want to see them, she whispered. You will, he promised. That night, Edward booked a medical transport to bring Claire home with care and support. A therapist from the shelter agreed to come with her to help ease the transition. When he texted Sophia and Noah that they would be meeting someone very special soon, Sophia replied instantly with a row of heart emojis and, "Is it mommy?" Edward smiled for the first time in what felt like years. "Yes," he replied. "It's mommy." Claire arrived at the Hale estate 3 days later, escorted by Renee and a trauma therapist who had been by her side every step of the journey from Colorado. The flight had been quiet, Claire alternating between staring out the window in silence and clutching the heart-shaped locket Edward had returned to her. Inside it, the faded ultrasound photos still remained, worn but whole. The weight of memory, painful, disjointed but real, seemed to grow heavier the closer they got to home, or what had once been home. Edward waited at the entrance of the estate as the car pulled through the wrought iron gates. He was dressed simply for once. No tie, no suit, just a white shirt and slacks. But his composure couldn't hide the storm inside him. When the car door opened, and Claire stepped out slowly, cautiously, their eyes met again. Not through photographs or memory, but as two people who had weathered their own versions of hell. She looked different, thinner, older. Her once bright eyes now carried shadows that hadn't been there before. But she was still her. And when she stepped onto the gravel path and he moved toward her, she didn't back away. Instead, she whispered, "This place feels like a dream I forgot I had." He took her hand. "It's real, and they're waiting for you." Inside, Sophia and Noah stood in the foyer, dressed neatly, their small hands clutched together in nervous silence. They had been told gently, lovingly, that their mother had been found. Margaret had sat with them the night before, explaining what trauma was, what memory loss could do, how healing took time. But they were children, and children have a way of cutting through fear with hope. Claire entered the room slowly, and the moment her eyes landed on them, she stopped breathing. Sophia stepped forward first. "Mommy?" Claire's lips quivered. "Sophia?" Noah moved next, his eyes wide. "You're real." Claire fell to her knees, arms open, and the twins ran into her embrace. She cried openly, uncontrollably, clutching their small bodies against her, as if afraid they would vanish again. She kissed the tops of their heads, their cheeks, their fingers, sobbing the words, "I'm so sorry," again and again. Edward watched from a few feet away, unable to stop the tears in his own eyes. It wasn't just a reunion, it was resurrection. A family torn apart had just found its missing heart. The days that followed were both beautiful and brutal. Claire needed rest. Her body was healing, but her mind was still full of blanks, ghosts, and fear. The twins were gentle with her, adapting naturally to her fragile state. Sophia would bring her drawings, laying them quietly on the nightstand. Noah insisted on reading to her before bed, often climbing onto the edge of the bed to read pages of the same picture book over and over. It was his way of making her real in his world. Edward worked from home, canceling all meetings for the foreseeable future. The board objected, briefly. He didn't care. This was more important than the stocks or investors. This was his family. Together they began to rebuild. Therapists came regularly to guide both Claire and the children. Play therapy for the twins, EMDR sessions for Claire. Gradually, the shadows in her eyes began to recede. She remembered the songs she used to sing. She remembered their wedding. She remembered the peach-colored nursery they had painted together. And then one evening, sitting out on the back porch beneath the stars, Claire said, "They took me. I was awake sometimes. I heard them talking. I wasn't supposed to survive." Edward turned to her, horrified. "They only wanted the boy. I don't know why," she continued, voice barely above a whisper. "I think they meant to get rid of me after. But I fought. I screamed. I ran. And then I remember nothing for a long time. Just pain and noise, and then nothing. It was a horrible truth, but a truth nonetheless." "We found him," Edward said softly. "We found Noah, and he's safe. You're safe." "They didn't win." Claire leaned her head on his shoulder. "But they stole so much." "Yes," Edward agreed, "but not everything." As fall descended on the estate, the family began creating new memories. They took walks in the garden. They baked cookies in the kitchen, flower dusting the air like snow. Claire started painting again. Sophia danced in the living room in a princess costume. Noah built elaborate cities out of Legos and insisted Claire help design skyscrapers. There were still moments when Claire's hands trembled, still nights when she woke from nightmares. But the love in that house, the kind built from shared pain and relentless hope, was stronger than fear. And one night, as Edward tucked the twins into bed and returned to find Claire asleep with a sketchpad in her lap, he gently lifted the paper. It was a pencil drawing of a man, a woman, a boy, and a girl standing hand in hand beneath a night sky full of stars. At the bottom, in Claire's delicate handwriting, it said, "We are whole again." Autumn gave way to winter, and with it came a strange and beautiful calm. The Hale estate, usually a place of polished marble and polished routines, had softened. Laughter echoed more often through the halls. The smell of warm cinnamon and fresh paint replaced the sterile scent of leather and cologne. In so many ways, life had started again for Edward and his family. But beneath the surface, there still lived a quiet urgency, a desire for justice, for truth, and for closure. Edward couldn't shake the thought of the men who had taken Claire. He couldn't rest knowing that someone had orchestrated the destruction of his family's life and had never faced consequences. Julian, ever tireless and sharp, had continued working in the background. In late November, he showed up at the estate with a folder that would once again change everything. They met in Edward's study, where floor-to-ceiling windows framed the snow-covered gardens beyond. Julian placed the thick folder on the desk and looked Edward in the eye. "We found them," he said simply. Edward felt the breath leave his lungs. "Who?" "The men from the clinic, the fake orderlies. And more than that, we found the man who hired them." Julian opened the folder and laid out photos, bank records, and names. At the center of it all was a name Edward knew: Marcus Langford, a former business rival, a ruthless biotech entrepreneur who had tried and failed to acquire Hale Tech years ago. Langford had vanished from the public eye after a slew of lawsuits and investigations. But clearly he hadn't disappeared. He had simply gone underground. According to the records, Langford had funded a secret operation that exploited vulnerable pregnant women for illegal adoption schemes. Some for profit, some as experiments for a disturbing fertility trial project. Claire had been one of the last victims before the operation shut down and all traces were erased. But one nurse had kept a log. She had written down Claire's first name and the word twins. "They thought they'd erased it all," Julian said. "But someone made a mistake." Edward stared at the name Langford, fury rising in his chest. "Where is he now?" "Hiding," Julian replied. "Offshore accounts, shell properties, security teams. But if we move carefully, we can build a case that sticks. The feds are already interested." Edward sat back, stunned. He wasn't a vengeful man, but this wasn't just about revenge. It was about protecting others, about making sure no other family was destroyed the way his had been. Claire was in the kitchen when he told her. She was kneading dough with Sophia while Noah built a fort under the kitchen island. He sat beside her, took her flour-dusted hand in his, and spoke softly. As he explained, her hand stilled. Her face went pale. "It was him," she whispered. "Yes. I remember his voice," she said, blinking fast. "He was the one who told them to separate the twins. He thought I was unconscious. I wasn't." Edward nodded. "Julian recorded that. We have it." She looked at him, eyes fierce and steady. "I want to testify." "Claire." "No, I need to do this. For them." She glanced toward the children, then back. "For me." And so the process began. With the help of a legal team, Claire prepared a statement. She sat through long sessions with prosecutors and agents, each time recalling more details, painful, fragmented, but crucial. Sophia and Noah weren't told the details, but they knew their mother was helping stop bad people. Sophia painted a picture of their family surrounded by shields and swords. Noah asked if they could throw the bad man in a volcano. By January, Claire had testified before a federal grand jury. Edward flew with her, holding her hand in the courthouse hallway while she waited. He watched her walk into that room, tall and steady, no longer the fragile shadow of herself she'd once been. Langford was arrested a month later. The news exploded across media outlets. Headlines blared, "Tech tycoon behind adoption ring brought to justice." Hale Tech's stock rose, not because of scandal, but because of the moral leadership Edward had quietly demonstrated. Yet Edward avoided cameras. He wasn't interested in the spotlight. He was interested in healing. As spring approached, Claire stood in the same garden where she had once painted her first sketches with the children. Now Sophia and Noah played tag among the tulips while Edward watched from a distance, his heart full in ways he never thought possible. Claire turned to him, eyes soft. "You saved me," she said. Edward shook his head. "You came back. That was all you," she smiled, reaching for his hand. "Then let's never let go again." And they didn't. That evening, as the stars returned to the sky, Sophia asked if Claire would sing the lullaby again, the star song. Claire hesitated only a second before humming the melody. Slowly, her voice grew stronger, and Edward realized he hadn't heard that sound in 6 long years. It was beautiful. It was home. Summer bloomed over the Hale estate like a long-awaited miracle. The gardens, once trimmed with military precision, now burst with color in wild, joyful chaos. Sunflowers that reached higher than the hedges, butterfly bushes overgrown with life, and soft clover patches perfect for picnics under blue skies. The walls of the house, once echoing with emptiness, now resonated with the sounds of childhood. Laughter, footsteps, singing, the occasional shriek of delight. It had been just over a year since Claire had returned home, and what once seemed like a dream stitched together by hope and desperation had become a life. A real, full, beautifully imperfect life. Claire had reclaimed her space slowly, one room at a time. She'd started painting again, her works now filled with light and motion, images of Sophia and Noah running hand in hand through fields, of a faceless woman stepping out of shadows into a sunrise, of stars reflected in dark water. Her nightmares still came, though less frequently. When they did, Edward was always there, never questioning, only holding her hand until the shaking passed. She called them her ghost waves, but now, she said, they receded faster each time. Sophia had blossomed into a fiercely empathetic little girl. She still asked a million questions, still tried to mother her twin, and still loved her routines. Saturday pancakes, bedtime stories, drawing on the patio. Noah, who had once been quiet and unsure, now raced ahead of everyone with boundless energy. He loved inventing games, building obstacle courses in the backyard, and reminding people he had a twin sister and a mom and a dad, so basically he won the family lottery. Edward had never been more deeply changed. He'd stepped back from daily operations at Haletech and had installed a new CEO, one he trusted to carry the company forward. He remained chairman, but his real work had shifted. He now dedicated most of his time to the Hale Foundation, which he had created in partnership with Claire, supporting mental health initiatives for women who had survived trauma, particularly those affected by trafficking, exploitation, or family separation. The foundation was Claire's vision. She refused to be defined only by what had been done to her. She was determined to rewrite the narrative, not just for herself, but for women who had no one to speak for them. She began giving speeches. At first, they were small: women's shelters, local clinics, recovery groups, then a TED Talk, then a guest appearance on a national morning show. Her voice, once lost for years, had become her most powerful tool. Every time she spoke, Edward watched from the wings, proud and heartbroken in equal measure. The courage it took to step out of the shadows she'd been shoved into was more than he could comprehend. But Claire did it, again and again. One warm August evening, the Hale family hosted a garden party for the foundation's anniversary. The guest list included donors, friends, survivors, doctors, and people whose lives had been touched by Claire's story. Twinkle lights were strung through the trees, long tables were set with wildflowers and candles, and children played hide-and-seek through the hydrangea bushes. Claire stood beside Edward in a simple white dress that fluttered in the evening breeze, her blonde hair pinned back with wildflowers that Sophia had picked herself. As the crowd gathered, Claire took the microphone, her voice steady. 2 years ago, I didn't know who I was, she began. I didn't know my name, or my family, or my purpose. I lived in a fog that I didn't think would ever lift. But someone found me, my husband, my children, and they reminded me that even when you've lost everything, even when someone tries to erase you, you can come back. She looked at Edward. Love is the memory that never leaves. It's the compass that leads you home. The applause was long and thunderous, and Edward, who rarely cried in public, had to turn away to blink back the tears. After the speeches, after the dinner, after the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the children had fallen asleep on picnic blankets under the stars. Edward and Claire walked hand in hand to the lake at the edge of the property. It had once been her favorite place before everything changed. They sat on the old wooden dock, their feet dangling over the water. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't found me?" Claire asked softly. Edward didn't answer right away. Instead, he let the silence stretch between them like a deep breath. "I try not to," he finally said. "Because I didn't find you, Claire. You found your way back. I just never stopped waiting." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I think maybe both can be true." They sat in the hush of night, the stars reflected in the water below like hundreds of tiny echoes from the past. Glimmers of pain, of survival, of hope. Everything they'd lost. Everything they'd rebuilt. "I was so afraid I'd never be whole again," Claire whispered. Edward looked down at their hands, fingers intertwined, wedding bands glinting in the moonlight. "We're not just whole," he said. "We're stronger than we've ever been." Behind them, the soft hum of the party continued. Music, voices, laughter. A family reborn, a legacy redefined. And in the quiet between heartbeats beneath the vast night sky, Claire knew that her story had not ended in darkness. It had only just begun. The ending of this story is a deeply emotional culmination of loss, survival, and unbreakable love. What makes it so powerful is not just the reunion of a broken family, but the rebirth of every character involved. Claire doesn't simply return home, she reclaims her voice, her identity, and her strength. Edward, once a man defined by power and control, learns to lead with heart, vulnerability, and purpose. And the children, born into chaos, now flourish in safety, surrounded by love. What I love most is that the story doesn't rely on perfection. There are shadows, there is trauma, but it respects the reality that healing isn't instant. It's layered, slow, often painful, but always possible. The happy ending isn't fantasy, it's earned. In a world full of stories about brokenness that never mends, this one reminds us that families can be rebuilt, memories can return, and the truth, even after years buried in darkness, can lead us back to light. It's not just a story of reunion, it's a story of transformation.